Hi, this is Corey Johnston, and today's lesson is going to come from the 11th chapter in the Book of Kings. And there is no parallel account to be found in the Book of Chronicles because each respective authors wrote with a different emphasis in mind. The author of Chronicles, Kings and Chronicles very much overlap, but Chronicles concludes on the 9th chapter with the visitation of the Queen of Sheba, of which we read of in the 10th chapter of Solomon. And the author of Chronicles was writing from a priestly perspective, whereas the author of... So he didn't want to show the warts and all, in as much as the author of Kings laid the warts and all bare and naked for all to see. But before we dissect the chapter verse by verse, we just want to open with Deuteronomy, two verses, the first of which is Deuteronomy 17:17, and this is the relevant excerpt of the standards and expectations for Israeli monarchs, and it reads, "And he is not to increase wives for himself, lest his heart turn away, nor is he to greatly increase silver and gold for himself." Now, in the visitation of Elohim to Solomon, he asked him for, he being a 19-year-old and aware of the awesome task before him, asked for the wisdom to rule his great people. And because he did not ask for the things which would have been selfish, such as great riches and prestige and the death of his enemies, Elohim saw fit to grant him that. So Solomon was, by figures adjusted to inflation, one of the trillionaire rulers of the ancient of history. And but the wives was something that he eventually led to his downfall, as we will soon read. And the next verse is Nehemiah 13:26. This is in the context of Nehemiah addressing the plague of mixed marriages, which were endemic not only amongst the priesthood but the laity. And there was nothing racist about this injunction. Yahweh specifically commanded it with the mind of maintaining the purity of his covenant nation intact, uncontaminated by the disruptive and corrupting influences of paganism. And he uses Solomon as an example. And in the 13th chapter, 26th verse of the books which bears his name, he writes, "Did not Solomon, king of Israel, sin because of them? Among the many nations there was no king like him, who was beloved of his Elohim, and Elohim made him king over all of Israel. Even him foreign wives caused to sin." So Solomon's reign very much constitutes what may be deemed the golden age of the united monarchy of Israel. Their geopolitical influence was very much at its apex, and their wealth and commerce was that too. But Solomon, much as Louis XV said, "After me comes the deluge," and that was visited upon his son and his grandson and successor, Louis XVI. That would very much be inflicted upon his son, Solomon's son and successor, Rehoboam, as we will soon read. Now we're going to open to the chapter itself. Remember, this is the 11th chapter in the first book of Kings. "And King Solomon loved many foreign women, in addition to the daughter of Pharaoh, Moabite, Ammonite, Edomite, Zidonite, and Hittite woman." So in the 3rd chapter, in the first verse, we read that he was arranged with, he had an arranged marriage with Pharaoh's daughter, who the purpose of which ancient royal marriages would have been to, it was the policy of him to make love, not war, and he succeeded in establishing his sovereignty's influence through commerce and diplomacy, and the nature of royal marriages was to cement alliances. But since the daughter of Pharaoh, he had since taken on a multitude of wives, as which we will soon read. He had 700 wives and 300 concubines, the concubines most of which would have existed for his sexual pleasure, the wives not necessarily so, but to cement alliances and diplomacy. And we read of the variety of nations which he was ensnared by. "From the nations of whom Yahweh said to the children of Israel, 'You do not go into them, and they do not go into you, for they shall certainly turn away your hearts after their mighty ones.' Solomon clung to these in love." So again, the purpose of separation is to keep the covenant people of Elohim away from the contaminating and corrupting filth and the issue of the prohibition against mixed marriages for the nation of Israel was constructed for the very purpose of preserving their ethnic and religious, spiritual purity intact. And he warned them that marriages with any outsiders would inevitably invite that corrupting influence into his covenant people. But in the new covenant, Christians are the racial, socioeconomic, and gender barriers, restrictions, and exclusions are eliminated. But we just want to appreciate the different dynamics of each covenant. And he had 700 wives, princesses, and 300 concubines, and his wives turned away his heart. So even though he probably didn't have sexual relations with all 700 of them, they are identified as the ones who turned away his heart. The concubines would have been selected probably for their physical attractiveness. The queens and wives would have been selected for their political usefulness. But as we read, when he was married to Pharaoh's daughter, the first of his foreign wives, he built a separate palace for her outside Jerusalem, where she remained free to worship her deities according to her own cultural traditions. But by this point, he had invited so many into the central palaces and allowed them to effectively set up shop in the nucleus of the covenant nation. And it came to be, when Solomon was old, that his wives turned away his heart after other mighty ones, and his heart was not perfect with Yahweh his Elohim, as was the heart of his father David. So even though Solomon's reign very much constitutes the golden age of the united monarchy, David was the model monarch in the standard according to which all others were measured, and he is identified as a man after Elohim's own heart implicitly in 1 Samuel 13:14, and more explicitly in Acts 13:22. And one of the promises which was given to Solomon was a conditional promises when he was visited by Elohim in the 3rd chapter of this book and the 1st chapter of 2nd Chronicles, was that he would be granted long life, which he did not wish for, but there was a condition attached, inasmuch as he remained faithful to the path and the walk of David. And both father and son respectively reigned for 40 years. Yet Solomon inherited the throne at age 19. David ascended to the throne after some struggle. He was anointed by Samuel even before he killed Goliath as a baby. So David lived to be 70 years old, and Solomon prematurely expired at the age of 59. And Solomon went after Ashtoreth, the mighty one of the Zidonians, and after Milcom, the abomination of the Ammonites. Now, I'm not entirely sure where the Zidonians specifically hail from, but they, in all likelihood, would have been an adjacent nation or people to the Promised Land, and the Ammonites were one of the aboriginal inhabitants who the Israelites had displaced, and one of the reasons they had been commanded to exterminate them was because of their filthy and abominable religious practices, which were unacceptable in the sight of Yahweh. Thus Solomon did evil in the eyes of Yahweh, and did not follow Yahweh completely, like his father David. So even though prior to this point, as recently as the 10th chapter, we read him giving effective and worthy witness to the king of Sheba, and who praises the Elohim of Israel for endowing them with such a king. And in all the preceding chapters, there's no indication at this sudden term. And even though the narrative presentation suggests that it was abrupt change, it was in all likelihood gradual and incremental. Then Solomon built a high place for Chemosh, the abomination of Moab, on the hill that is east of Jerusalem, and for Molech, the abomination of the children of Ammon. So the Ammonites and Moabites were respectively the descendants of Lot's incestuous liaison with his sisters, and Moloch was the god to whom child sacrifices were offered, and this is a particularly abhorrent practice, one which is alive and well in our own age. The number of aborted fetuses is their sacrifice simply for the god of convenience. in most cases. No two situations are exactly alike, but I do believe the generalization is accurate. And so he did for all his foreign wives, who burned incense and slaughtered to their mighty ones. Therefore Yahweh was enraged with Solomon, because his heart had turned away from Yahweh Elohim of Israel, who had appeared to him twice. Now, the two specific instances in which he appeared to him were at Gibeon, of which we read of in the 3rd chapter in the same book, and in the 1st chapter in the book of Chronicles, and I believe he also theophonically visited him. That's the theological term for a tangible manifestation of the divine entity sometime thereabouts when constructing the temple. So he is really without excuse for not obeying the Elohim to whom he had personally encountered and envisioned. Therefore, and had commanded him concerning this word, not to go after other mighty ones, but he did not guard what Elohim had commanded. So the breach of idolatry was a significant one, inasmuch as it would result in the fracturing of the united kingdom of Israel, so too would it result in the captivity of the split kingdoms, the northern kingdom of Israel and the southern kingdom of Judah, respectively. And Yahweh said to Solomon, because you have done this, and have not guarded my covenant and my laws, which I have commanded you, I shall certainly tear the kingdom away from you, and give it to your servant. The servant of whom we will soon read is Rehoboam, who was the first king of the 10 northern tribes of Israel, and he was an effective and able servant to whom he had, we'll soon read, placed in charge of his public work programs, and he was specifically delegated authority over the tribe of Ephraim, or Joseph, I believe, which would have also included the half-tribe of Manasseh. And even though it was promised to Solomon, for reasons of which you will soon read, because of his great love for his father David, he would not splinter the kingdom in his own lifetime, but it would become finalized during the reign of his son and successor, Rehoboam, of whom we read of in the next chapter. Only I do not in your days, for the sake of your father David, out of the hand of your son I shall tear it. So I said much of what I could have said before that I could have saved for after, but moving on. Only I shall not tear away all the kingdom, but give one tribe to your son, for the sake of my servant David, and for the sake of Jerusalem, which I have chosen. Now, even though the kingdom would be designated Judah in reference to the dominant tribe, it also included the territory of the tribe of Benjamin, through whom Saul, the original monarch of the United Kingdom, hailed. And also because Rehoboam immediately turned to idolatry, the Levites were more comfortable setting up shop. The Levites were the designated tribe for the priestly services, and they were more comfortable staying in the temple that Solomon built. So that's more like 3 than the 1 in all accuracy. And Yahweh raised up an adversary against Solomon, Hadad the Edomite. He was of the seed of the king in Edom. Edom were the descendants of Esau, the older twin brother of Jacob, through whom whose 12 sons respectively formed the patriarchs of the 12 tribes of Israel. And it came to be, when David was in Edom, and Joab the commander of the army had gone up to bury the slain, after he had smitten every male in Edom. So Joab was David's most trusted general, and he resisted Absalom's rebellion. But in the 2nd chapter of this book, we read that he sided with Adonijah, who was one of the rival claimants to the throne that David had granted to Solomon, and Solomon summarily discarded him and executed him. Joab remained there with all Israel for 6 months, until every male in Edom was cut off. That Adad fled to go to Egypt, and certain Edomites of his father's servants with him, while Hadad was a little child. So they had fled in response to the conquest initiated by Joab, and the king of Egypt eventually, we read, embraced them, gave them shelter, food, and arranged a marriage with one of his sister-in-laws, I believe. So even though the earlier alliance was cemented by Solomon's marriage to Pharaoh's daughter, eventually that alliance exhausted itself. And they arose from Midian and came to Paran, and took men with them from Paran, and came to Egypt, to Pharaoh, king of Egypt, who gave him a house, and ordered food for him, and gave him land. So he very much embraced him and treated him with all the dignity of a royal, befitting a royal guest. And Hadad found much favor in the eyes of Pharaoh, so that he gave him as wife the sister of his own wife, the sister of the queen Taphanes. So we don't. Now, the only pharaohs who are mentioned by name, I believe, are identified in the book of Jeremiah and somewhere else. I think there's 2 of them, but herein we learn that the queen is identified by name. And the sister of Taphanes bore him Ganobad, his son, whom Taphanes weaned in Pharaoh's house. And Genoboth was in the house of Pharaoh, among the sons of Pharaoh. So he was effectively adopted by Pharaoh, much as Moses was. And Hadad heard in Egypt that David slept with his fathers, and that Joab, the commander of the army, was dead. And Hadad said to Pharaoh, "Let me go to my land." So after all this time, the general who had caused so much menace to his people was long dead and gone, so much so that he felt secure in returning to his kingdom, which had been wrested from his control. And Pharaoh said to him, "But what have you lacked with me, that you are now seeking to go to your own land?" And he answered, "No, but please let me go." So Pharaoh was initially perplexed by the request, in that he had everything he could conceivably want, need, and desire under his roof, but he was adamant in his insistence. There is no place like home, and even in the magnificent palace of the Pharaoh would have been no substitute for this man. And Elohim raised up another adversary against him, Rezin son of Elidah, who had fled from his master, Hadazekar, king of Zobth. And when David slew him, he gathered men to him, and became commander over a raiding band. And they went to Damascus, and dwelt there, and reigned in Damascus. So even though this rival entity lacked the power to seriously inflict damage or conquest of Israel, they were very much a perpetual nuisance at the border, and they commenced in raiding parties. And he was an adversary of Israel all the days of Solomon, besides the trouble that Hadad caused, and he was hostile to Israel, and reigned over Aram. And a servant of Solomon, Jeroboam, summoned Naphath, an Ephraimite from Zethapah, whose mother's name was Zeruah, a widow, also lifted up a hand against the sovereign. So Jeroboam was the original founder of the dynasty of Israel, and that would not be a permanent dynasty, unlike the king, which remained firmly seated from David's descendant all the way to Zedekiah. And this is what caused him to lift up a hand against the king. Solomon had built Millo, repairing the breaks in the city of David his father. And the man Jeroboam was a brave man, and Solomon, seeing that the young man was doing his work well, made him officer over all the compulsory labor of the house of Joseph. So he was sufficiently efficient in his task, so much to impress Solomon, to elevate him to the be in charge of his compulsory labor, and eventually his grandiose appetite for building projects compelled him to force Israelites into forced labor, unpaid, effectively equivalent of slaves, an explicit violation of the Mosaic commandment, and this formed the significant grievance which served as the pretext for the rebellion of which his formerly able and entrusted servant would eventually lead. And we read that he fled to Egypt when Solomon became wise to his ways, but he would return and succeed as promised by the prophet, of whom we'll soon read, to finalize the splinter of the kingdom. And it came to be at that time, when Jeroboam went out of Jerusalem, that the prophet Abiah the Shilonite met him on the way, and he was wearing a new garment, and the two were alone in the field. And Abiah took the hold of the new garment that was on him, and tore it into 12 pieces, and said to Jeroboam, "Take for yourself 10 pieces, for thus said Yahweh the Elohim of Israel, See, I am tearing the kingdom out of the hand of Solomon, and shall give 10 tribes to you." So the symbolism conveyed in the tearing of the garment into 10 pieces were symbolically representative of the 12 tribes, which would mark the people he would rule over. "But he shall have one tribe for the sake of my servant David, and for the sake of Jerusalem, the city which I have chosen out of all the tribes of Israel." So even though the Davidic dynasty, and more specifically the capital city of Jerusalem, remained the center of his affection, even though Solomon by this point was not meriting of his affection. "Because they have forsaken me, and bow themselves to Ashtaroth, the mighty one of the Zidonians, to Chemosh, the mighty one of the Moabites, and to Melcom, the mighty one of the children of Ammon, and have not walked in my ways, to do what is right in my eyes, and my laws and my justice, as did his father David." So he had forsaken the path which would have guaranteed him of a long life had he stayed consistent in it, as he successfully did until seemingly recently. And he had forsaken him by participating in the worship ceremonies of the foreign idols, the erroneous deities of the adjacent nations, and he had departed from walking in the ways which he had formerly been faithful to do. "But I do not take all the kingdom out of his hand, because I have made him ruler all the days of his life, for the sake of my servant David, whom I chose because he kept my commands and my laws." So it was not so much, by this point he was wrathful and enraged at King Solomon's deviation and his failure, but David, who maintained the path of the straight and narrow with some deviations throughout the course of his life, most significantly the murder of Uriah and the adulterous liaison between him and Bathsheba, who actually would end up being Solomon's mother, who he elevated to queen not long after he sent Uriah to die in an impossible battle scenario. "And I shall take the kingdom out of his son's hands, and give it to you, the 10 tribes. And to his son I give 1 tribe, so that my servant David shall always have a lamp before me in Jerusalem, the city which I have chosen for myself, to put my name there. So I take you, and you shall reign over all that your being desires, and you shall be king over Israel." Israel was the name applied to the united monarchy, but after the splintering, the name would be referenced to the 10 northern kingdoms, whereas those of the south, remember the Judeans, the Benjaminites, and the Levites, or at least the majority of, would reside. And it shall be, if you obey all that I command you, and shall walk in my ways, and do what is right in my eyes, to keep my laws and my commands, as my servant David did, then I shall be with you, and build for you a steadfast house, as I built for David, and shall give Israel to you. So much of the same promise which was earlier given to Solomon was given to Jeroboam, who unfortunately almost immediately turned to idolatry, effectively expelling voluntarily the Levites who performed the vital priestly function, and their waywardness would be somewhat permanent. Every king who rose after him in the northern kingdom of Israel would be invariably idolaters, whereas those of the Judean line which would somewhat longer outlast the Israel king, would be a fluctuation between reformers and idolaters. And because of this, I humble the seed of David, but not forever. Remember, in the 7th chapter of 2 Samuel, he promised David an unending kingdom in heaven, and that would be largely manifest through his biological descendant, the Messiah, even though his secular or temporal kingdom would cease to exist as an independent sovereignty in the year 586 BM, before Messiah. And Solomon sought to kill Jeroboam, but Jeroboam rose up and fled to Egypt, to Shishak, king of Egypt, and was in Egypt until the death of Solomon. So I earlier misspoken that I identified one of the named pharaohs as in the Bible as being named by Jeremiah, but herein we also read that this king had a specific name, that being Shishak. And the rest of the acts of Solomon, all that he did, and all his wisdom, are they not written in the book of Acts of Solomon? Now, this is one of the several lost books referenced in scriptures, and it probably, in all likelihood, wasn't inspired and inerrant, at least in the equal sense of the books formulated into the collective canon, but they still would have been useful for historian items. Unfortunately, they vanished in the sands of time. And the days that Solomon reigned in Jerusalem over Israel was 40 years. Remember, he inherited the throne at age 19 and would expire at the age of 59. He could have lived longer, but sadly he succumbed to the snares of his idolatrous wives. So Solomon slept with his fathers and was buried in the city of David, his father, and Rehoboam, his son, reigned in his place. And Rehoboam would have been an unmitigated disaster, as we read of in the next chapter. It was his foolish intemperance which compelled. Now, the grievance of compulsory labor was by this point exacerbated, and Jeroboam eventually approaches the new king and asks him to lighten the load, or maybe some delegate of the northern kingdoms. I'm not entirely sure. But Rehoboam says, come back in 3 days, and the elder men who had advised his father Solomon offered the more prudent line of advice to lighten their load, meet them at least halfway. That's not an unreasonable request, but the young men who he had gravitated around and grew up with at court advised him to adopt the harsher posture and said that my father stung you with whips, but I will sting you with scorpions, and that irreparably teared the united monarchy of Israel permanently asunder. And that's all the time we have here today. Thank you so much. Tune in next time. Bye-bye.